Hello, beautiful people. This is Bamby Salcedo, greeting you and sending you so much love and appreciation. Before we start, I want to acknowledge the land where we're standing on today and the land where you may be. I am and we are in Tongva land in Los Angeles. And in this time that we're together, I want to invite you to call to the four elements that ignite our being. I hope that our conversation sparks the fire that we all have within and that inflames all of our listeners to understand and to take action. I hope that the water will help our conversation and thoughts to flow freely with no limitations or barriers. I hope that the wind inspires us all to deliver the message that our people need to hear and listen today, and that it penetrates our hearts and minds, and it continues to provide the strength that we all need to continue to move forward in this world. And with much humbleness, I also want to call upon our Mother Earth, who continues to provide for all of us and who continues to give us everything that we need to exist. We ask our Mother Earth to feed us with strength and power, and that we feed our soul and the souls of the people who are listening. And it is with great honor that we invoke the spirits of our ancestors to guide us and to give us the strength, intelligence, tenacity, and power to continue to move forward in this world and continue to fight for what is right for all of our peoples. Today, I have the immense honor and great privilege to share space with Zeferino Llamas, also known as Zef, who is a Chicano illustrator and a wildlife conservationist from San Diego, who also creates resources and visual narratives about public health topics such as sexual wellness, mental health, and immigrant rights for Rainbow Pride Youth Alliance, which is an Inland Empire based queer youth advocacy organization. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bamby, for having me.
Of course. Um, I wanna, I wanna start um, with just a simple question. Um, Tell us in your own words who you are, where you're coming from, you know, how'd you got to where you are, and who you are today.
All right. Yeah. So I'm Zef, from San Diego originally, like you mentioned. My background, I studied wildlife conservation, right? And then I had a moment where I was able to work in a wildlife reserve. It's like a national park, but in Mexico.
Mm.
This was almost 10 years ago now.
Where
And
exactly?
in El Valle de Tehuacan is like
Wow.
in southern Mexico between Puebla and Oaxaca. So it's a really big reserve and it kind of straddles both states in the Mixteca Alta the, of that like region.
That sounds so beautiful.
It really was. And I was there for a few years. And one of the differences between a national park in Mexico and a national park in states is all about like philosophy. So in the USA, national parks, the way they're seen is wildlife and wilderness needs to be separate from human beings. It needs to be
Mhm.
pristine and untouched. And that philosophy comes from the Protestant Anglo American way of seeing things. And that's is what it is, right? That's the way we see things broadly in the United States. But in Mexico, the history is different, right? The relationship that people have with the land is different, such that you can't really separate humanity from nature because culturally we see ourselves as integrated as one one and the same, right? As like children of the earth, if you will.
Mm, I love that.
Yeah, and the way that's reflected in land management in Mexico is that the La Reserva de la Biosfera, what we would call a national park here, it's all the same. There's basically two main goals. The first one is to preserve the biodiversity of whatever ecology you're talking about, but the second goal is to respect the traditional way of living of the people who still live in any given reserve. So in Mexico, there's over 68 native languages that are still spoken today, and there's at
In that region.
no, in all of Mexico, but there's
Okay.
at least that many, if not more, ethnic minority groups. So what in the U.S. you might call a tribal group, but in Mexico would be an ethnic minority. And anyway, so the someone who's working for the reserve, they're working together with the people who live there, the indigenous people, mm, to forward whatever they're doing. Say it's like local mezcal production or something like that, and that's what they do to stimulate the economy. So the reserve will come in and work with them to make it more economically viable, make it more in their interest, right? And it also brings tourists to the region. So they're trying to work hand in hand with the communities there. The other benefit of working with the communities is their traditional land management systems. So people have been working the land in a certain way, working together with the land so that both benefit, so that people benefit and so that the land benefits as well for thousands of years, right, in the region. So ecologists and managers in Mexico recognize this and want to work together with the local communities as opposed to like
Right.
ignoring
Mhm.
traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous peoples and just going with the Western way of approaching land management. Anyway, long story short,
I really appreciate that because,
yeah,
people really need to know that,
yeah,
right? Because especially in the United States, like you said, right? Like there's this separation, right?
mm,
And it's beautiful that we can get to learn how, people that work in Mexico specifically, right? But what led you to study that and to like get there essentially, and then come back here and find your way to do the work that you do now?
originally, I just wanted to work in the environment somehow because I thought it was important and interesting.
Mm.
And then it wasn't until moving to Mexico that I realized
There's
just
more.
there's more, yeah, because it's not just ecology, it's not just science or land management. It also has to do with culture, with what do you call it? Ethnobotany, the relationship that human beings have with the land and with plants. This idea that plants have consciousness and they communicate with us.
Mm.
The way we communicate these ideas through art and like visual narratives. And so all of that came up during my time there. And I always liked to draw and illustrate. And so these two things came together at one point. That we did murals in the reserve with in the community where I was living, and people would participate. It was a community project, and talking about the local histories and stuff like that. And it made me realize also just how important visual narrative is. It isn't just some frivolous thing. It's important to the way we understand the world.
That's so
Yeah.
amazing. And I'm like thinking I want to connect with you more because we're actually the Translatino Coalition is building a new center.
Mm.
And so we should chat about
Oh, no,
cards and
yeah.
all of that and see if we can find ways to work together. Um and so you're telling us specific thing, right? And in terms of like, wildlife and the environment and how you got to be where you are today, right? But what is it that needs to happen for people to really grasp the importance of understanding the connection between wildlife and us, humanity, right?
Mm.
Or
Before you answer, let me just have you sit up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you started good, and then little by
Well,
little.
it's good. I'm really relaxed. I'm hosting. I'm
Yeah.
hosting, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm hosting.
It just happened. So
Oh,
it just
okay.
happened. So it was just I'm like, as soon as you're done with your question, I'm gonna let you know. Okay,
Okay.
you're good.
Did you did you get it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Una, dos, dale.
I'd say that, okay, there's lots of different ways to approach it, right? But as an individual, we can look at ourselves and be like, what is the way that I can approach it? Right. And so always think about this idea of Pan American unity. It's this idea that like 100 years ago was really popular. There was a lot of collaboration between the United States, Mexico, Central America. And it was this idea that the Americas could be like one big zone that together work together, like in the way that Europe does, for example. So at the time, Diego Rivera, for example, was
Mhm.
doing murals in Detroit, in San Francisco, that kind of thing. That was part of that movement, showing that we're all connected. The history of the Americas is something that we all share in, right? And today, 100 years later, that story has been not lost completely, but it's not something that people are thinking about on a day-to-day basis, even though the militarization of the border is so present in the minds uh, of everybody, and especially if you go south of the border, there's you talk to any person, the militarization of the border affects everybody in some way or somebody that they know, right? And in my eyes, I'm like, the key to let's say having a sustainable future has to do with this relationship between cultures. We need to understand each other in order to move forward. And so what that means isn't just it doesn't mean doing away with the way things are done now necessarily. Like, let's say that we work today within the framework of like Anglo Protestant worldview, right?
Pretty much.
In and of itself, it's not bad. The problem is that it's a narrow framework, knowing that we live in a multicultural society and that there are other ways of looking at things. So it isn't a matter of like destroying the Anglo Protestant worldview or approach to things. It's more about expanding the framework so that more ways of seeing and more ways of approaching issues can be included, which includes like approaches from different cultures.
Right, but you know that there's an active effort to ensure that why the white extremist people, right, like to really raise cultures and to, um, I mean, they're using this rhetoric of like woke culture.
Mhm.
They're using, um, really um, racism like in your face now, right? Like it's always been there, but it's now like people got permission to, you know what I mean, to be racist and like in your face and like not really caring, and so that is actively happening right now. And so how can we let people know then that in order to change things, that this understanding needs to happen, right?
Something that I think about a lot is like what can we do? A person can only do so much, but it still matters what we do. It's like
But there's movements.
right. Okay, so this is what I'm
So
getting
like
at.
if we're thinking about like what can we collectively do, right?
Yeah.
It also starts with an individual, but then it leads to the collective, right?
So there's this idea in when you're talking about mm, exactly about this, about the influence of European philosophy and ways of doing things in here in the Americas, the way it relates to uh, let's say Mexican Americans, for example.
Correct. Yeah.
And so the idea is about la segunda conquista, the second
Mhm.
conquest. So the la segunda conquista is refers to the first conquest as the conquest of the body. So Spanish arrive, enslaved the people to build the colony, right? New Spain. the second conquest is the conquest of the mind and of the spirit.
Mm,
And so it's the conversion to Catholicism. It's the changing the way of viewing things, the doing away with the ancestral knowledge, right? And so I always think about the La Segunda Conquista and the way it affects people without even knowing it. They might not even be conscious of it, right? But something that we can do, the La Primera Conquista that happened, we can't do anything about it because it happened. We
right.
can remember, we can affirm the history and all that, but it's something that happened. La Segunda Conquista is something that continues to happen, that
Mhm.
continues to get reinforced on a daily basis and in a person's daily life. So what we can do, what is in our hands, is to fight that second conquest by thinking for ourselves and also connecting ourselves to our heritage and to our ancestral knowledge, right?
I mean, like what you're mentioning, it really sort of like brings me back to how through La Segunda Conquista, right? And through the indoctrination process that happened, right? Like how the sort of like this, I guess I'm gonna say the starting of the erasure of trans gender nonconforming people, right?
Mhm,
Because it was through this indoctrination process, right? Because we have existed in different cultures forever,
mhm.
but that happened, and like you said, that this actively happened, right? So how do we create consciousness also about people understanding that we as trans people have been here, right? And they're building false narratives about us, right? Also, people who are religious, extremists, Protestants, or como le quieras llamar,
Mhm.
right? Like, I mean, using us for people to think, right, the worst of us, right? Like that we're not worth it and stuff like that, right? And so, how do we provide this consciousness to people to understand that we are part of the tapestry of our society?
I think that in my case, it's been a matter of tapping into different frameworks, right? And so if we're talking about Mexicans and Mexican Americans, we have that information. It's just a matter of seeking it out. And so what I'm talking about is the spirituality, philosophy, and ancestral traditions of Mexico, specifically like the Altiplano Central, the central valleys of Mexico. And it's some people call it the Mexicayotl, is the La Mexicanidad ancestral.
Learn.
And I feel very privileged because I was able to live in Mexico and I was able to learn about it because I was living in a place where the tradition is still very much alive, right? And so I was able to immerse myself in it and it benefited me in a huge way. Not everyone has that opportunity.
Mhm.
And so what I like to do is just try to transmit that knowledge through visual narrative and just talk about it. Just talk about like, hey, this is our culture. We have a certain framework for seeing things, especially here in the US. It's not that it's bad in and of itself, but you can broaden your understanding by connecting yourself more with your own culture, which in a lot of senses this culture has made the attempt to erase or to take out of your hands. So don't let them take it out of your hands.
Yeah. But do you think it's important that we, um, instead of just trying to preserve our traditions and our way of living and nuestras costumbres and all of that, right?
Mm.
Um, do you think it's also important to try to influence the way those oppressors and marginalizers and essentially murderers of our people, right? Or descendants of murderers of our people. Can you Do you think it's important that we influence their way of thinking? And if so, how can we?
I think, yeah, absolutely, it's important, especially because we live in a place that, first of all, was at one point part of Mexico, right? I love this Chicano saying. It says, "I didn't cross the border crossed me."
That's amazing.
And I love that because it makes people remember that, like, yeah, there's a history there. This land was illegally obtained by the United States, right? So that's one thing. Um,
But people don't recognize that, particularly white people, right?
right. But the second thing, and I think that's really beautiful, is that if you look at language families in the Americas, uh, Nahuatl, which is the most spoken language in Mexico after Spanish, right? It's a native language. It is connected. It's part of this language family called the Udo-Aztecan language family. Excuse me. And that language family, if you look at it to where it comes from, so it kind of landed in the Central Valleys, and that's where it really, uh, where Nahuatl, for example, got all these speakers, millions of speakers, right? But if you trace it back to its origins, it starts in Utah, like in the Southwest. That's why Udo Aztecans is the Udo comes from Utah. And so you can see the way it travels down through California, Baja, down the coast of Mexico, and then ends up in the Central Valleys. And so let's say you're a Chicano and you don't have an awareness of that history, but then you start hearing about it or you learn about it somehow and you realize like, no, there's a connection here. Like I'm not separate and no one can tell me that I'm not rooted in this place, even if I'm from LA, say, because I'm aware of my own history. And on top of that, it's just a beautiful thing, right? To show that there's connectedness between the peoples of central Mexico all the way up through to the southwest and into the mountain west regions. And they're all connected culturally and linguistically.
I appreciate that you're mentioning this, right? Because there's a richness to knowing this, right? But even in our own communities, oftentimes, people feel ashamed of, you know, being brown you know, or being indigenous looking or, like that kind of stuff, right? Like, and I can understand why, right? Because it's all part of the indoctrination stuff that happened, right? But how do we deliver that message to our people, right? That there's richness in being who we are, like understanding where we come from and the culture and all of those beautiful things, right? So how can we do that while at the same time, um, making sure that I guess white people recognize, that as well,
Mm.
right? I mean, because I'm thinking about like what is happening in Florida, for instance, right? Like they're banning books. They're like actively, right? Like making sure that we essentially our history and our the knowledge that exists is erased, right? And so how do we ensure that does not happen? And how do we start with our own people?
It's hard to say because, like, for example, so I'm Mexican American, but I'm white, right? My skin's white, I look white. And I've had moments where I'll be talking to someone and they'll be saying something racist, right? I'm like, "Hey, whoa, like, I'm Mexican." And they're like, "Oh, but you're not, like,
You're not
Mexican."
Mexican.
And what they mean is, like, you're not brown, so, like,
That's so
therefore,
crazy.
what I'm saying doesn't apply to you. And what they're saying is, like, my problem isn't with Mexicans, my problem is with someone who's, like, has dark skin. And in those moments, all I can do is just be like, let them know what they're doing, right? And maybe they'll think twice before assuming that somebody else is also racist
Mm.
or something. But I think another important thing is just to embrace our stories. Can I share one?
Of course, please
Okay.
do.
So
Yes.
one of these, because you hear a lot about, okay, ancestral knowledge and philosophy and everything, but what does that mean, right? And so there's a lot there, and we can't like talk about all of it, but just as like an
I love
example,
it. Let's talk about
is we're talking about like the four directions
it.
saying. So the four directions, east, south, west, and north. And there's a lot to say about the four directions, but one of the stories that comes from the Mexicayatl that really love is this idea that it's a cycle, right? So it is a cycle of the sun as it takes its journey, its daily
Mhm.
journey through the sky, rises in the east, its transcurso, its journey is in the south, it sets in the west, and the north is the darkest part of the sky in the northern hemisphere. That's where it's regenerated, where it dies and then experiences a transformation so that it can be born again. And so that in and of itself is beautiful, but the philosophy there also points to the individual. So it's this idea that we are born,
Mhm.
and in that part of our life, it's all about growth and all about the newness and the renovation of life, right? And each of the directions is associated with different ancestral spirits or deities. And so in the case of the East, it's the Xipetotec, and he's the representation of that, of new life. And then in the south, it's Huitzilopochtli is the spirit of the sun, and it's this idea that during this period of our life is when we're most productive. It's at the end of that first period that we find our purpose in life, our dharma, what the Buddhists call it, and then during the trajectory of the sun during the day, the southern portion, Huitzilopochtli, that's when you realize your purpose, when you do all the work that you need to do in your life, right? And then once you get to the west, that's Quetzalcoatl, and Quetzalcoatl represents this idea of connecting the material world with the spiritual world. So starting to make those connections, and also starting to wind down with life. As we draw closer to death, we're drawing closer to the spiritual world.
Mhm.
So we're trying to reconcile the material, which is our life, and then the spiritual, which is ever present, but also where we're all going once we're no longer in our bodies. So that's the east, where the sun sets, right? It's very symbolic. And then the north is Tezcatlipoca. And so this is the spirit associated with magical transformation and with the subconscious mind. So death happens, and death is a moment, but death opens a door to this transformation where our spirit is renovated and opens up the way for the cycle to begin again, for new life to occur, and it all starts all over. And so those are the four directions, and there's a fifth direction, which is the middle, and it's like the axis mundi, like the el eje central, around which everything spins. And so that axis mundi is the individual, so that's you. And so as you observe the sun throughout the day, you can be reminded of your own life and the journey that you're on. And it's something that you can think about on a daily basis to motivate you, to keep you going, but also to recognize that you are connected to something that's greater than un todo.
Claro. I mean, wow. I appreciate so much that you just enlighten us with not just the circle of life, but the also the symbolism of eternity, right?
Mm,
And this idea of how some people call it God. I choose to call it God, right? It's like within you, right? Which is el eje,
mhm.
el cual hablas, right? And so thank you for giving that gift to all of us. I think that is a beautiful thing to close, but you know, I wanna also learn so much from you, but I also want to, to for you to share with our audience, like some of like the work that you've done in terms of like illustrations or in terms of like, yeah, some of the work that you've done, like where can people find your work or where
Oh,
can people
sure.
can find you or yeah, like anything that you want to share with us about you and the amazing work that you do.
Thanks. Yeah, Instagram's a great spot. Zeferino con Z, ZEF, Zeferino. And then zeferino.mx is my website.
I love
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Beautiful people. I mean, this conversation is like deep and amazing and beautiful. And I'm sure we're probably going to have like another episode at some point, if you allow me to, to continue this conversation. But I really hope that this conversation has given you a bit of knowledge and that you also feel inspired. And we're really hoping that, what we have, what Sam has shared with us, has given you power and that you are able to use your power to influence change in the world. Um, and that you also influence others to do the same. Um, and, I'm just so grateful that I get to live this moment with you, Zeferino, Zef. Muchísimas gracias. Beautiful people, please remember to always live your life to the fullest and always be free. Um, and of course, be fearless always. I appreciate you so much for tuning in with us. Thank you, Seth, for being here with us.
No, thank you, Barry. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
The Fearless People podcast is a product of Bamby Salcedo and is produced by Mejia TV and can be found in all major podcast platforms. You can support this podcast by liking this episode and subscribing to it. You can also support my retirement by rating this podcast and following me on social media. Thank you so much.